again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in the skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts, in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you. So, no surprise who we're looking at today, because we've got the handout with Margaret Hayes. I imagine many of you know Margaret Hayes, but hopefully some of you don't, or it would be good to be refreshed. I've also brought her books from the bookstall, because I thought it'd be easier for you to pick them up and then take them and add them to your pile. There's three of her first book, which is probably the one to read first, if that makes sense. And then, even though it's a reluctant missionary, she wrote that second. There's a couple of those, and they are definitely a good read or a good gift. So Margaret, again, is a lived example of those verses we've just read. And as we hear her story, we'll see both her frailty and her faith. As 11:34 says, whose weakness was turned to strength. So she's another example to us, another witness of a life lived trusting Christ. 10:34 says, you suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you had better and lasting possessions. And that could be used to describe Margaret both in the way she endured and the way she was willing to endure. She's another woman who was willing to give her all for her Lord. Another frail saint who kept her eyes on Christ, with the reward of being with him face to face in view, and whatever else she might receive in glory. We'll see her, as 10:39 says, as one who did not shrink back. And again, she's worthy of that epithet. The world was not worthy of them. Margaret Hayes was a contemporary of Helen Roseveare, and we've probably heard more of Helen Roseveare. I don't know whether she just wrote more books or whatever. She was also caught up in the Simba rebellion in Congo in the 1950s and 1960s. And for those of you who think that's ancient history, believe me, it's not, because some of us were born around then. I know for some of you it is. Speaking of what was happening in Congo at the time, the General Secretary of UFM, which was the mission Margaret was to go out with, said there's a story in Congo to be told, not just of what man is doing to man, but of what in the midst of terrible happenings God is doing for man. So Margaret Hayes was converted aged 18, the fifth of 8 children from a non-Christian home. Labelled a religious fanatic by her family. I was labelled that. I heard someone else saying that yesterday. Converted at 19 from a non-Christian home. She faced almost daily mockery at home. Thankfully I didn't. But it was all part of the Lord's preparation, and she learned early to trust and rest in his daily grace. As a young woman, as a young Christian, she'd listened to the final message at a certain famous convention and clearly felt God's call not just to mission, but specifically to Congo, which at that time was under Belgian control, so it was known as the Belgian Congo, later became Zaire, and now DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've given you a map, it's a landlocked country right in the centre of Africa, which you can see. Oh, has anybody got a spare? Is there a spare map, Jane? Oh, someone, thank you. Yeah, you can see on the little map on the left there. And yes, it is an out-of-date map, but that's for very obvious reasons as we go on. She'd been happily working as a ward sister for the previous 3 years. Any nurses here? I've got to be more. She also had a speech impediment. So why would God choose someone like her to serve him in this way? Yet the call was confirmed as, no surprise, she spent time in God's word day by day. Actually, can we close that door now? I'm feeling quite a draft. Is that okay? Who made man's mouth, she read in Exodus 4:11. We know who that was said to, don't we? Moses' speech problems were no reason for him to disobey God's call. And so it was for Margaret, and she recognised that. And the final promise that convinced her that this was God's will for her was Philippians 4:19, my God shall supply all your need. She applied to UFM, she attended Bible college, and then she went off to Paris to learn French. That meant living with a kind Christian family, kind but only French was allowed in the house. Language learning was a challenge for Margaret, but she knew the Lord's help. She then spent time in Belgium to develop her French in a Belgian context while studying tropical medicine. Wow, that's quite a challenge, isn't it? The deal with UFM was if she passed all 8 exams in her tropical medicine in French, they would accept her to go to Congo. With God's help, she did. So she goes back to England from all this training in March 1957 with a plan to go in May 1957, just a couple of months later. But she needed to raise £500, that's another part of the deal, before she went. That's the equivalent of about 11,000 now. But God had promised to supply her every need. Money started to arrive from friends, from anonymous donors, and the last £35 arrived the day before she was due to set off. Even her family had to acknowledge that God was at work, though they continued to reject him as Lord. So at age 25, Margaret was commissioned by East London Tabernacle for the Belgian Congo. And at the commissioning service, Margaret talked about her first school essay that she'd recently come across. They'd been given the theme, when I grow up, I want to be, and Margaret had put a missionary in Africa, though she wasn't from a Christian home and was far from being a believer at that point. So she arrived in Belgian Congo in 1957, and it was a culture shock. It was a land of contrast, and just having come back from Kenya a couple of months ago, it's, to be honest, very similar now in many parts of Africa. The rich flaunted their wealth in clothes, cameras and cars, and poor people lived in the bush in mud huts with hammocks slung between poles. What we saw is they now have plastic chairs to go alongside those. Margaret learned to live like this too. Young children would be naked, the diet was sparse with little variety. Communication was generally by jungle drums, both within the village and between villages. When it was Sunday services, the drums would be started an hour before, then 15 minutes before, then 5 minutes before, so people would get there. She also had to learn to enjoy deep-fried caterpillars so as not to offend her host. She actually developed a taste for them, and ants and locusts. Protein where you can get it. She spent her first year stationed at Maganga, which you can see, sorry, I've got dreadful writing, but it's the little arrow going down the bottom of the map, so it's a bit off the map where we end up spending longer. And there she worked alongside nurse Nora Parry, who is pictured on your handout with her family sort of there. So she worked alongside Nora. There was no electricity, no running water. Again, it's the same in many places of Africa today. Bathing was in half an oil drum. The toilet was long drop, same still today, which was a hole in the ground in a small mud hut. Sadly, that mud hut was also home to spiders, scorpions and lizards. Her first day, she was called on to do a forceps delivery. Well, in the UK, a forceps delivery was always done by a doctor, so this was her first. She prayed hard. The patient, as she entered the maternity unit, was on a bed of bamboo slats, just 6 inches or 15 centimetres off the ground. The forceps had been sterilised in a cooking pot over the fire. To Margaret's relief and thankfulness, a baby girl was soon delivered, and she was the first to be named Margarita after her. First of many. Margaret found life challenging, understandably. She was often asked to work far beyond her training and experience, and she found the conditions depressing too. So she learned again to pray for daily grace. And again she knew God's help and enabling. She knew his miraculous interventions. She relied on the great physician to guide her beyond her human skills. After a while, she moved to Bonganza, which is, there's a little cross, sort of in the middle. Can you see it? Bonganza, Bongondza. So she moved there. The missionary's house there was a bit luxurious. It had made of cement blocks. It had a tin roof, and it actually had glass in the windows, which is very unusual. Also, running water from a storage tank, but still no electricity. Here, Margaret had to learn to do skin grafts. The doctor would give the patient a spinal anaesthetic, and then Margaret would be left to get on with it, often with spectators at the windows. The gospel would be preached to the patients in short meetings at the beginning of each day and in individual conversations, and many trusted in Christ as Saviour. The government then saw fit to build a maternity block in Bonganza, staffed by missionaries though. It was equipped with beds, bedding and cribs, but the local women couldn't get their heads around why would you separate a mother from its baby, but they actually found the cribs really useful for keeping their personal belongings in. Antenatal clinics included a gospel message and a scripture verse to learn. Once the women had remembered 5 verses, they were rewarded with a gift of soap or a mirror. At the pastor's wife conference, each woman received a little bar of soap and was thrilled. So things haven't changed too much, have they? Some women had real interest in spiritual things, but they wouldn't take the step of faith without the permission from their husbands, which was a bit of a blockage at times. Then, 2.5 years after Margaret had first gone to Congo, problems started. So what was the situation in the late 50s in Belgian Congo? Well, many colonial governments were preparing to grant independence to other African countries that they had colonised, but not so in the Belgian Congo. It had been under Belgian rule since 1908, so 50-ish years. The nationals in Congo heard about independence in other parts of Africa, and understandably they wanted it too. So unrest followed and an uprising occurred. It started with riots in the capital, Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa, which is off to the left of your map. And it caused the Belgian government to lose control over both the economy and the military. Belgium then gave in to demands for self-rule in January 1960. But whilst other countries had prepared the nationals for independence, there'd been no preparation because it hadn't been their intention. So 50 plus years of colonial rule was more than the lifespan of most. There were only 12 graduates in the country, and sadly it was all a recipe for the chaos to come. Many in the country spoke excitedly about independence. They believed it meant power, money and no need to work was their thinking. And the fragile situation was compounded by great political unrest, which you can read about in their books. It resulted in them having a Conservative president and an opposition Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister had previously been convicted of embezzlement. That situation didn't last too long because the Prime Minister was then assassinated. Independence Day came on June the 30th, 1960. Just 5 days after that, the army mutinied. European civil servants left immediately. The authority of this troubled government wasn't accepted by all, and it escalated, causing great financial difficulties. So, naturally, embassies ordered their nationals home. UFM and other mission agencies did the same. So Margaret then had to return to the UK for 2 years, although she'd only been there a couple of years. And what she discovered was another cost of the missionary. And remember this when you have missionaries who return home in any way. It's hard to slot back into life. The people she'd known close personal fellowship with had moved on, had changed, and perhaps she'd changed even more. A positive result, though, of these couple of years back in the UK was that she'd been really struggling with debilitating migraines, which she was fearful would end her missionary service. And she was tried on a new drug, which actually really helped these to become manageable. Then Margaret and others returned to Congo again 2 years later, but the economy was shattered, plantations had been neglected, education was in chaos, the dirt roads had deteriorated and the forest had encroached. So by 1964, the rebel army had taken control of the northeast of the country, and that's where Margaret was located. The rebels called themselves Simbas, meaning lions. You're probably familiar with that. Unfortunately, Mary, who she was to work with, had a dog also called Simba, which did cause some problems. But anyway, some of those Simbas were just boys aged 9 or 10, and for some reason, those young boys were strangely honoured by the men and allowed power. They had sort of various uniforms. The picture on the second page of your sheet shows them in some quite distinct uniform. Don't look too carefully at that. Turn back. Sorry. But the other thing they would always wear is some pieces of fur around their head and wrist because they believed that gave them strength from the spirit. Some had guns, but others were often armed with only machetes, spears and clubs. These Simbas took food, possessions and people as they chose. The National Army feared them and would flee. They murdered people for ridiculous reasons. A local man and a mission teacher was condemned to a firing squad with 2 others for the crime of wearing a Western shirt. Amazingly, the men on either side of him died and he survived unscathed. As Homer Dowdy, this is if you really want to get into this, Homer Dowdy wrote this book, again it's an out-of-print one, Out of the Jaws of the Lion, which is all about not just what happens with Margaret but with others in the Simba uprising. He says, it was not primarily racial hatred that brought about the atrocities, but cold calculation for political power. Hundreds of foreigners in Congo would face imprisonment, torture, death, abuse. So there's lots who suffered in this way, but we're just going to focus on Margaret and the group that she was part of. Any sense of any kind of stability was very short-lived because these bands of young men were terrorising both the locals and focused on the mission stations. At the end of June 1964, the United Nations pulled out their peacekeeping forces because the budget had run out. Some Congolese leaders were now in charge, but many of them were power-crazed despots. Margaret is now in Bapepe, which is, it's just a little bit down from Munganza. Spelt Bo Peep on your map, but pronounced Bapepe. So that's where she is in 1964. It's near the equator, it's a hot and steamy jungle area. But Bapepe was a special village. Every adult in the village was a baptised believer. There was a brick-built church in the centre with tree trunk pews, and they had a daily 6 a.m. prayer meeting for the whole village. All villagers were involved in evangelising the surrounding villages, and people came seeking help as well as spiritual help as well as medical help, and many found Christ. Margaret would again have to handle medical cases beyond her skills, but the village elders would pray for her as she did so, and the Lord graciously answered again and again. Margaret lived and worked alongside the American Mary Baker. You probably worked her. So that's Margaret up in the top left, and that's Mary Baker next to her. So they shared a home. It had cement floors, had holes but no windows in them. They had a kerosene oil fridge and cooker when they could get the oil, no running water. They had a small generator which would give them a few hours of power in the evening when they had the diesel. And their home was also home to quite a number of tarantulas, which they got used to living alongside. Mary was an evangelist and greatly loved by the locals. In fact, they considered her to be one of them. She'd been there quite a long time. She held the belief that a missionary might be called to give up their life in the service of Jesus. And in a letter to her sending church, Richmond, Virginia, she wrote this: Jesus died for me. Why shouldn't I expect to die for him? Remember those words. Margaret was tasked to start a medical ministry in the village, and it felt overwhelming. She continued, though, to trust God to supply all her needs. So she started this dispensary in the mission house, which then became much more than a dispensary, with a operating theatre and all sorts of things. The villagers adapted a broken down building. It was made of wood, wattle and mud. Wood, wattle and mud. Yeah, I was trying to get my wood and mud mixed up. And it had a leaky banana leaf roof. They furnished it with packing cases they got hold of, but it was always full of creepy crawlies. Again, no running water and just this little bit of power in the evening. They divided it into 3. There was a waiting room in the centre which could pack in 70, and each day would begin there with a Bible message for those waiting. On one end of the building was the maternity section and the other the dispensary. Another building nearby housed 3 2-bedded rooms and kitchens for the relatives to cook for their patients, their own relative patients. And here Margaret encountered and treated her first leprosy patients. In July 64, Margaret and Mary were also working hard, amongst everything else they were doing, to prepare for a conference. And this was a conference for their church leaders, both nationals and for missionaries, and it was to be held in their village at the Pepe. The major item for discussion was, should they evacuate the country again? The village had twin pastors. I only managed to get a picture of one of them, so I think that's Asani, Pastor Asani on here. Pastor Asani and Bo Martin. Apparently they were I have seen another picture of them. They were identical twins, so you get the idea. Sorry. And they set and enforced a strict moral standard in the village. Asani, who's pictured here, had a premonition though in a dream that a terrible time. It's on the front page, Ruth. All right, sorry. You're not supposed to read the second page. Sorry. that a terrible time was coming. And that they were about to witness much bloodshed and atrocities. Asani was the president of the Congo Protestant Council, and he was nervous about this conference bringing together a large number of people in one place, but his objections were overruled. The Pepe was packed out, and there was great fellowship. The men had left their wives and families at their own mission stations, but they were able to contact them daily at a pre-arranged time on fixed wavelength radio calls. The week ended with Bob McAllister from Northern Ireland preaching on Matthew 26:39. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. The workers, with that ringing in their minds, returned to their homes and places of ministry inspired by their Saviour's example. I can't remember, where do I start on the dates? Is it the first? Oh yeah, we're nearly there, sorry. Bev's going to do some writing up for me. Mary then felt Margaret needed a break. They'd been very busy. And they also needed some practical supplies to be replenished. So on Saturday, August the 1st, I'm asking Bev to do this timeline for us because, don't know about you know when you're reading a book and it gives you a date, then the next chapter it gives you another one. And particularly if you're reading on a Kindle, it's really hard to find what the first date, and I've forgotten by then. So if anybody's like me, there you are. So Saturday, August the 1st, Margaret set off for the mission station at Banjwadi, which you can see a bit. So if you go down from Pepe, past where it says Benalia and Ferry, and down to Banjwadi Seminary. So she went down to that mission station in Banjwadi. It's 40 miles north of Stanleyville, which is now Kisangani. So that was helpful, so she'd be able to go and restock there. It was planned that she'd go and do that, and then 3 weeks later, Mary would come in her van and collect her, and they'd travel back to Bo Pepe together. On her way to Banjwadi, Margaret spent the night partway with a government doctor and his family, and they listened to the BBC reports of trouble spots in northeast Congo. They weren't hearing much, although they had a sense of what might be going on. The next day, she had another bumpy bus ride until she eventually did arrive in Banjwadi. Arriving at noon on the Sunday the 2nd, she met Banjwadi workers and other old friends who were all also visiting this station. They ate together, they held a service, and it was to be their last normal Congo Sunday, though of course they didn't know that at that time. It was normal for all the mission stations to contact one another at noon each day. And then they learned that the mission station at Wani Rakula, which again just go down a little bit further, Wani Rakula Bridge, you can see, the mission station there that had a German couple hadn't been heard from since noon on the Saturday. They all agreed to pray and call in again at 4 p.m. that day. Still no news. Then there were reports of unrest in Stanleyville, and they were told to be ready if evacuation was needed. Before going to bed that night, on Monday, August the 3rd, David, who was part of the group there, read from Daily Light. Some of you will come across Daily Light. It becomes even more important in this story. He read from Daily Light on August the 3rd, and you can still read the same readings on the same days. Fear none of these things which thou shalt suffer. Be thou faithful unto death. Revelation 2 verse 10. Tuesday, August the 4th. The BBC reported rebels advancing around Stanleyville, and there was great anxiety amongst missionaries and locals. Midday, still no news from Wayne-Rakula. Gunfire was being heard in Stanleyville. The field leader, Al Larson, said planes were available for evacuation out of the Congo. But the missionaries thought back to what had happened in 1960. They'd evacuated, that everything had been uprooted, the work had been stopped for 2 years, and actually nothing much had happened that would have caused them any problems. So they all decided to stay. Again, they arranged radio calls. They arranged to call HQ every hour. This wasn't the refreshing holiday that had been planned for Margaret. They heard there was a curfew now in Stanleyville from 3:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. They responded by concentrating on prayer, meeting together 5 or 6 times a day. Al Larson then ordered them not to leave their stations, as by then Stanleyville Airport and national radio stations were in rebel hands. The National Army had fled, and the rebels were pursuing the National Army. Africa Inland Mission was able to get news to family and prayer supporters in the UK because most of the Africa AIM missionaries were Americans. The rebels were very anti-American, so they had all evacuated. The Americans had generally, not all, but most of them had evacuated, or many of them had evacuated. For on-air security, they chose to refer to the rebel army as Robert, sorry, not Sarah, and the National Army as Louis. During one radio call, Al announced Robert has arrived and went off air. They prayed fervently for Al, for his wife and small daughter, imagining the awful things they might be facing, which they did, but thankfully they survived. Margaret says of this time, the great value of the Word of God is one of the memories I have of those days. It seemed that every reading was written for the specific needs of the moment. Those who were together were using devotional readings together by F.B. Mayer and Spurgeon, and Margaret says, words written over 100 years earlier are so relevant to our particular situation. When comparing notes in their individual personal devotions, again, it was amazing how they all seemed to coincide. Whilst Mary was alone in Bopepe, 10 Simbas came in when she was on a radio call. They were already suspicious of her as an American. She was one of those who hadn't decided to evacuate. And they became convinced that she was broadcasting to America. So they took the radio. And this happened at other mission stations too. So they became unable to communicate. Another time, a great group came and threatened Mary, pointing a rifle in her face, asked her if she wanted to die. She responded she had no fear of death. When they eventually left, they took her shortwave radio too. So now she couldn't communicate and she couldn't even hear what was going on sort of through the BBC World Service. Margaret was concerned that Mary was alone in Bopepe, so she was given permission for her to find transport back. So Margaret then got an unexpected lift with a Belgian doctor in a vehicle who was also carrying Simbas. They spent a night at his house in Benalia, which again is where the ferry is, right sort of in the middle, along with the Simba escort. Margaret felt it wise to lock her bedroom door. And she read in her daily light for Saturday, the 29th of August, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, makest me dwell in safety, and I will trust and not be afraid. And she slept all night. She made it back home to Bopepe on the Sunday, and Mary was so delighted to see her, as were the villagers. In fact, she arrived during the service, and the preacher brought it quickly to an end so that they could have a wonderful reunion together. The missionaries had started to sleep in their clothes, aware anything could happen. Obviously, the Bopepe radios had been taken, but Margaret did have a little transistor radio so they could hear a bit of what was going on. Margaret and Mary spent much time in prayer together along with the villagers. But then that became impossible because the Simbas thought they would be political meetings because Mary was American. Food became short, although sometimes food would arrive, supplemented by the chickens that Margaret raised until they ran out, sadly, because many of them were stolen by the Simbas. who also took the oil for the generator and the kerosene for their fridge and lamps. So patients in need of operations would have to wait for daylight. Some villagers were rounded up and taken away by the Simba rebels. November the 4th. Just before midnight, 6 half-naked Simbas arrived, palm branches on their heads and chests, brandishing spears. Margaret and Mary, they were told, were under arrest, along with Pastor Beau Martin. And then nothing much happened for the next few hours. Early next morning, being Sunday, the Simbas sent all 3 of them to church. Though the tension was great and the whole congregation deeply upset at what was happening. The Simbas then carried out what they called an inspection, and they demanded explanations of the purpose of medical instruments. Margaret was then allowed to go and lock up the hospital, though much had been damaged. The plan was then to take them the 15 miles to Benalia, again by the ferry, Benalia. Daily light that morning was 1 Peter 4 verse 12. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you. As Margaret later wrote, we knew everything was in the permissive will of God. Lorries that had been promised to transport them didn't arrive, so they were going to have to walk 15 miles on a hot, cloudless day. They packed suitcases but knew they couldn't carry them. Then 2 teachers from the village volunteered to carry the cases on their bikes. They set off to Benalia and then came back later, and Margaret and Mary were able then to ride the bikes because Mary was 50 by then and was really struggling with arthritis. The drums passed on the news of what was happening to the villagers as they went along. And as they passed through each village, groups would gather to greet them and weep for them. And the village women, interestingly, berated the Simbas for what they were doing. As Margaret and Mary walked before they got on those bikes, they reminded themselves both of the sufferings of the Lord and of his many promises. Margaret actually says, it really felt like Jesus was walking with us. Our hearts burned within us. Eventually they arrived at Simba HQ in Benalia, which was a requisitioned home of a European. The self-appointed Simba leader then assured them they wouldn't be beaten or killed, but they were billeted in another house, not the one he was in, that was in a dreadful state with a filthy toilet. 1 single bed, and there were 20 plus adults in prison there. They were soon joined by others from their mission, and they're on here, the Parry family, Dennis and Nora. Dennis was an evangelist and mission handyman. Nora, the trained nurse that Margaret had worked alongside before, with their children, Andrew, who was 10, and Grace, who was 8. The other 2 children were in, it says it, doesn't it, in school in England at the time. The children had suffered much cruelty as they'd been taken there, being repeatedly hit round the head, jabbed with spears, mocked, forced to walk and carry luggage. Grace had been made to dance for them. Having been forced to leave in such a great hurry, they had no Bible with them, so Margaret gave them hers. She shared Mary's, and she still had her daily light. Nora was obviously distressed about the treatment of the children, and also concerned for those 2 children so far away in England. The Simbas gave them no peace that night. They mocked, they sang hate-filled songs. Yet amazingly, during that night, a young Simba asked Margaret how to have Christ as Saviour, and he prayed and accepted him as Lord. No food was provided, though some local believers brought what they could. It was cold, and eventually Beau managed to get some blankets to them. A new truckload of Simbas arrived and ordered them out of the house, shouting threats, gesturing throat-cutting. And Margaret says, strangely, all fear left me, and I said to them, I'm ready to die. Are you? At times they did have access to a real bathroom, which was a real delight during the day, but then would be returned to these squalid conditions at night. The Sharp family also on your sheet, Ian, Dr. Ian, Audrey, Gillian 8, Alison 7 and Andrew 4 arrived along with nurse Ruby Gray, who's also pictured there. Again, they'd endured an arduous journey full of humiliations. Young Andrew was physically disabled after contracting polio earlier. Ian Sharp and Ruby Gray were set to work in nearby Benalia Hospital, but again, the challenges were huge. All the beds had been stolen. No water, no toilet facilities. The supply of food for missionary prisoners came to an end because the locals who'd been helping to provide that were threatened to have their home burnt down. The Simbas became more and more hostile and increased their threats. One form of torture they devised was demanding that they smoke cannabis. All of them refused, but one priest that was in prison with them was forced to do so until he vomited. One night, one by one, they were made to stand for hours at a time in their bare feet by the stinking toilet, and these cannabis smoking guards became increasingly irrational. Saturday, November the 14th, Margaret read promises of great comfort from daily light. Proverbs 14:26. In the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. And Jeremiah 1:8, I am with thee to deliver thee. After 3 weeks' captivity in Benalia, a plane flew over, causing great panic among the Simbas. They were feared they were about to be bombed. They readied themselves to shoot the prisoners if this looked as if it was going to happen. Margaret continued her usual pattern of daily readings, as did the others. She kept coming across promises of deliverance, and she shared this with Mary. And Mary said, for you, Margaret, but not for me. I think I'm going to die here. Nora also thought she was being prepared for death. She had read Romans 13:11, now is your salvation nearer than when you believed. Monday, November the 23rd. Margaret was then given a road pass and told to return to Bo Pepe to resume her medical duties. Whilst glad to be out of their squalid prison, she was confused. Why was only she chosen to leave? As she left, she asked Ian to remember her if the mercenaries arrived to rescue them and to direct them to her too, and to save her a place on the plane out. Ian responded, we'll meet either on the plane or in glory. Dennis's farewell words to her as she left were, if we don't meet down here again, I'll see you in heaven. Were these God-given indications of what was to come? So Margaret left with a mixture of emotions, a sense of aloneness and fear of what she described as almost tangible evil. Yet she held on to the promise God had given her that morning. Proverbs 1:33. Whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely and shall be quiet from fear of evil. Tuesday, 24th of November. 1,200 hostages in Stanleyville were liberated by the National Army. They parachuted in and got some ground troops in. The city was completely retaken by the national government by 3 p.m. Though most hostages held there were liberated, 35 were killed in the fighting. The city of Ekiti, which is northwest of Benalia, you can find that's a little bit further up, sort of by a river bit, was likewise reclaimed. And you can see but Pepe is in between those two cities. Unaware that Margaret had arrived back in unaware of that, Margaret arrived back in Bepepe, and it was now occupied with Simbas, she was really warmly welcomed, of course, by the villagers, and they wanted news of all their friends who were still imprisoned in Benalia. Mary's dog and Margaret's cat joined in the welcome. But there were no phones, no longer any radios. The jungle drums passed messages from village to village that Stanleyville had been retaken and that the National Guard were heading their way to reclaim the land from the Simbas. Pastor Bow insisted Margaret go into the forest along with the local women and children to a hideout that had been prepared. Wednesday the 25th. Simbas, hurt from fighting in Ekiti, up in the north, were heading towards Stanleyville in hope of medical help. On reaching Benalia, they heard what had happened in Stanleyville. They realised they had nowhere to go. Their self-appointed Prime Minister had instructed if Stanleyville was attacked, all foreigners must be killed. At 3:45, filled with both fear and rage, they demanded that all those in prison there be brought out. Dr. Ian Sharp had been operating on a wounded Simba. He was taken with a Dutch priest, Reverend Herman Bischoff, who I couldn't find a picture of, to the ferry landing stage. They were made to strip, their throats were cut, their bodies thrown into the river. I won't labour this. The children were murdered next, and then the rest. Sorry. Killed with knives and machetes, thrown into the river, and any not dead was shot. Mary was the last to die at 4 p.m. I don't know why I do this. Isn't it easy, that sound? Margaret was in her jungle hideout, and she had a real sense of uneasiness all afternoon. She couldn't find peace even as she prayed. Mary's dog was with Margaret in the forest, and at 4 p.m. he started to whine and continued for half an hour. Don't know how we explain that. The bodies were never recovered, though local Christians wanted to find them. It was too dangerous for them to go near. Margaret recorded these dreadful crimes in Missing Believed Killed, quoting 2 Samuel 1:23, "In death they were not divided," and Revelation 2:10, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." And she reflects, "Thus they entered into the presence of the Lord to receive their crowns." Surely we can also say, the world was not worthy of them. We're going to have a break and have some time for discussion. We finish, is it 11? 11, yeah, okay. We'll have sort of about 10 minutes or so to have some discussion. I hated doing your discussion, but as I said to the group who moaned at me when I said come in, or groaned or something, do talk to each other later. Thursday the 26th, it's the morning after the massacre, but Margaret is still unaware of what's happened. Her daily life, reading that, I was just chatting again about daily life. Daily life is just scripture verses. It's not the only, it's not the best way to do your devotion, if you know what I mean. There's a lot better ways, but it's great, to. I often read it while I'm having my breakfast and, have my devotional time another time. Anyway, it was Isaiah 43 verse 1, "Fear not, thou art mine." I'm reading her version as well. Paul Pania, the mission school director, then came into the sort of jungle where she was hidden out to find her. He looked totally broken, and with great pain and sadness he had to tell her of the dreadful massacre, of the deaths of her friends and fellow missionaries. Margaret was obviously deeply shocked and saddened by this dreadful news, but then Pastor Bo said, "My heart is broken, but there's no time for sorrow. You must be hidden because the Simbas are looking for you to kill you." So Margaret was kept hidden in the jungle for the next few weeks. The Simbas kept visiting Bapepe, demanding she be handed over to them. Margaret would spend the greatest part of her day reading her Bible, knowing comfort from the Psalms, from Isaiah, from Jeremiah. And in this solitude, Margaret recognised she alone had escaped the Benalia massacre of that group of friends. So the Lord still had plans for her, and so she rededicated herself to his service. Someone heard a radio report which they passed on to her, and the radio report said that all the white people at Benalia had been killed. So Margaret realised it would be assumed that she was amongst them. She also realised that this would probably mean there'd be no rescue attempt for her. She felt also the deep pain at the realisation that her prayer support would end. And she prayed often that someone would be prompted to consider then she might still be alive and would continue to pray. And she later discovered that that prayer had been answered, and some of her support group had continued to pray. But Margaret also remembered a saying, though she couldn't remember where it was from. 4 words: "In acceptance lieth peace." Without knowing it, she was remembering the words of another missionary, words from a poem by Amy Carmichael. And in the last verse of the poem, it's on the discussion sheet, and even if you don't get time to discuss, you can take the sheet. The verse says, Jesus said, "I will accept the breaking sorrow, which God tomorrow will to his Son explain. Then did the turmoil deep within me cease. Not vain the word, not vain, for in acceptance lieth peace." Margaret couldn't at the time remember the source and know more than those few words, 4 words. But she accepted her lot, and this is what she found. She says, "As I surrendered to his will, I was overwhelmed with a great peace in my heart. I need not worry about the future, for it was all in the Lord's hands. One day the Simbas and the shooting got closer and shouting because they were calling out Margaret's name. Pastor Bo hurried her from the jungle hideout she was in, and they made their way through some really thick undergrowth. As they did so, she lost her travelling bag with her precious Bible and her daily light. She then heard a chilling message from the jungle drums. It said that 2 men had been murdered and that every house in Bapepe had been burnt down because of her. That Paul Pania, the school director who brought that news to her, was being led around the village with a rope round his neck and they were going to murder him. Margaret realised that the only way to stop this horror happening to her friends was to give herself up. She quickly wrote letters to her parents and to her mission, asking a local man if the National Army were ever to come that way to pass them on. Those letters were never delivered. She convinced she would certainly face death, and she asked the Lord 3 things. Might it be a quick death with a bullet? That she would die in trust of her Lord? And could the Lord tell her friends that she'd be joining them in heaven soon? I love that. It's now the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, and she approaches the Simba headquarters at Bapando, which is just north of Bapepe. Quite a walk though. As she did so, she quoted Psalm 23 to herself, and again she had such an awareness of the Lord's presence. She said she almost expected to see him walking beside her. So Christmas Eve, 1964, Margaret surrendered herself to the Simba rebels. She wasn't killed, but she endured much, much in the following 6 months. That Christmas Eve was certainly memorable, but in a horrible way. Margaret was surrounded by armed Simbas dancing around, gesturing lewdly, making threats, celebrating their longed-for capture of Margaret. She was then placed in a filthy hovel with Mama Ruta, a village woman she knew. Yet in their squalid surroundings on Christmas Eve, they remembered the first Christmas Eve. Surely the place that Mary and Joseph had found shelter was also poor and more fit for animals than for the birth of the Saviour, so similar to where they now sat. Then it's Christmas Day, and it included a somewhat bizarre situation when a Simba lieutenant produced an accordion and repeatedly played the 3 carols that he'd been taught at the mission school he'd attended. Though after 90 minutes of this repetition, the initial comfort was starting to wane. Christmas dinner was elephant meat and rice. So life as a prisoner. A while later, Margaret was taken back to Bapepe, and she actually discovered that her house was one of 3 that hadn't been burnt down, though it had been ransacked and stripped bare. Books had been torn up. Then, to her great delight, Margaret found an almost intact Bible. She was also allowed to retrieve her suitcase from the forest and at last was able to wash and change into clean clothes. And then she discovered the reason that the threats hadn't been carried out to kill her. They'd already murdered everyone else with medical skills, so they realised they needed her. A bike was found for her as her legs were very swollen and she had sores on them, and then she had to cycle to Benalia Hospital while the guards walked. When they arrived, around 2,000 Simbas were milling around. She was tasked to take what might be of use from the hospital, but there was sadly very little left. And then she was taken back to Bapando, and she was expected to treat over 200 every morning with the assistance of just 1 local male nurse. The Simbas didn't provide her with food. She had to scavenge or starve. And then eventually Pastor Bo was brought in as a prisoner, and he managed to contact a local Christian couple who did come and provide food. What a relief. But there were many challenges for Margaret still to face, as well as knowing some special touches from the Lord. And one of these, in a tree near Benalia Hospital, Margaret saw a blue book wedged in a tree. It was her own copy of The Edges of His Ways by Amy Carmichael. She was imprisoned and so lonely for friendship and fellowship, and it was just the encouragement she needed. During the hottest part of each day, Margaret would go to the landing stage by the ferry where her friends had been martyred to spend time alone with God. She was exhausted, starving, struggling with loneliness because the food had been stopped again. She found it hard to pray, yet she said she was always conscious of the Lord's presence and she knew his comfort. She was moved around frequently. One time billeted in Banjwadi, which again we've mentioned before. There she had the comfort of a real bed for a while and greater comfort as amongst the chaos of another looted building she found another book, God Holds the Key by Geoffrey Bull. We'll come back to him later. She was also able to listen to a radio and tune into the BBC, and amazingly she was allowed time off work to listen to the funeral of Winston Churchill. As she listened to that service, Margaret wondered if there'd been a memorial service for her. She later learned her home church in London had held one, as well as her name being included in memorial services too. I found this really moving, being involved in a mission, and we have a mission magazine. In this mission magazine, there are the obituaries of the whole number of missionaries, including Margaret's. And that's the link at the bottom of your handout. So if you follow that link, you can find that, and it's definitely worth a look and a read. She's then transported by tractor and trailer to Bangamisa, which is quite close by. Often food was just a handful of raw peanuts, but one day she was longing for eggs. So she decided to bring that before the Lord. And that afternoon, Simba brought 4 hard-boiled eggs to her, saying he'd met someone in the jungle who wanted her to have them. Another time, she was almost out of the soap that she'd got with her. She asked the Lord for soap. Within a couple of days, she'd been given 5 bars of soap. So God was answering so many of her small requests, but she struggled to understand why he wasn't answering her plea for deliverance. She kept asking that by a certain date she might be free, then changing it to another day, another anniversary, a birthday, whatever it was. But as she prayed in those ways for that release, she didn't receive the same assurance as she did for those smaller things. Looking back, she recognised she needed to learn patience, though living through it was so hard to understand. It's now late February 1965, we have no date because she didn't know, and she was taken to Buta, which is again on your map, sort of a bit north of Papando. It was a 170-mile journey north, a long and arduous journey in a truck, though it did get more comfortable when they transferred into a Cadillac that they requisitioned, though the driver was both drunk and continuing to drink. And then on arriving in Buta, as they got out, she saw the driver had a plaster cast on his leg. But God had answered prayers for safety on that hazardous journey, and her new prison was a convent with a community of 18 Catholic nuns. Again, there's a picture of them on your handout. Margaret introduced herself as Margaret Hayes of Benalia, and there was a shocked response. The nuns thought all the white people in Benalia had died, and she was warmly welcomed. Though she did feel a bit uncomfortable as a Protestant in a convent, but they said she was welcome as a child of God in need. In prison there was also Madame Legrosse with her daughter Chantal 6 and Anne 4. Margaret was welcomed, fed, given a shower, clean clothes, a room with a bed and a mosquito net. And then she saw herself in a mirror the first time in 2 months. She was shocked by how much weight she'd lost and the state of her hair. She told the sisters all about her time in captivity with the Simbas, and then that night enjoyed a deep and refreshing sleep, which she hadn't had for quite some time. The nuns would hold their regular masses, and Margaret was given a quiet corner of the chapel for her personal devotions. After 5 peaceful days, Margaret was then told she was going to be moved again. It was another dreadful journey. She witnessed men beaten for no reason. She had to spend the night in a village where every man was drunk. She barricaded herself into her room and she prayed. One night they stopped at Benalia and Margaret was sent to the ladies' house, which was a mud hut with a communal bed made up of mattresses with 8 women, and there, thankfully, she slept amazingly well. She was confused though. Why had the Lord allowed her 5 days of peace and luxury in a convent, followed again by such danger and deprivation? And the words of Philippians 4:11 came to her mind. I have learned, in whatsoever state I am in, therewith, to be content. And so she prayed, the Lord would indeed teach her contentment, whatever her circumstances. And she would read often from God Holds the Key. Geoffrey Bull had been imprisoned for his faith in China, so it was one prisoner speaking to another. And his words encouraged Margaret so much that she learnt some of them by heart and set them to music so she could sing. And these are some of those words. So, Lord, I shall not fall, I shall not faint. The grace enough for every baffled saint. Still through the wind-thrashed sea I glimpse thy form, and know thou hast thy footsteps in the storm. It's now March. She's been taken from place to place, dealing with deprivation, witnessing degradation, experiencing evil acts. And then she's delivered back to the convent for the next 3 months. Margaret had great respect for these sisters. There was never a crossword between them. They were also interested in Margaret, and they invited her to talk to them about coming to faith and her call to missionary service, and listened with great interest. Margaret recognised, though, that the Lord still had things she needed to learn. God holds a key, continued to be a continual source of comfort. Margaret described Geoffrey Bull as her preacher during that time. Passages such as this were a great help and challenge. He said, "My avowal surely was, Lord, I will lay down my life for thy sake. Yet the words of the Master still come back. Wilt thou? Wilt thou? Wilt thou?" Was she willing to lay down her life, to face death, to be crucified for her Lord? Again, she was led to reevaluate her life in the light of the cross, to be willing to face humiliation, degradation, self-denial, even death. It's now Saturday, the 29th of May. The tension seems to be increasing around. The trigger-happy Simbas past the convent. They're all told to keep quiet. They don't want to attract attention. They each have a bag packed, ready if they're going to be moved on. And then the Simbas do arrive at the convent, and they march them down the road to the nearby men's convent, where 31 men were. All of them were arrested that evening, whatever that meant. Pockets were searched, watches, rosaries, even Margaret's handkerchief were taken, all soon to be worn as prizes by the Simbas. They were made to march in pairs. There was no mercy for the old and frail. Their glasses were taken to become, again, status symbols for the Simbas. But they didn't like Margaret's because hers were for extreme short-sightedness, so they smashed them instead. Take yours off if you need them like I do. Can you imagine life without them? Margaret had to carry on, hardly able to see. The nuns' wedding rings were dragged off their fingers. The women were made to strip to their underwear, the men to nakedness. The sisters, some of them had their heads held, so they had to watch the nakedness of the men. The Father Superior was convinced all were about to die, and so gave the others the words of absolution, which gave them comfort, but Margaret rested in the assurance of the forgiveness of her sin, the finished work of her Saviour. And then they were allowed to dress again, and the men and women were separated. They were then herded into a room with no furniture, no toilet facilities. The humiliation continued. 2 men and 2 women would be taken outside at the same time to relieve themselves in front of one another. That was the only way they were allowed to do so. Thankfully, amongst all this needless cruelty, the Simbas generally showed kindness to the 2 little girls. Margaret remembered her vow to deny herself, to face humiliation, even death. She knew her Lord had prepared her. She knew he was with her, and by his grace she could get through and stay true to him. The priests, who were aged from 24 to 70, were then dragged outside and given what was called the command, their hands and feet tied behind their backs and pulled tight until their backs arched and they screamed in pain. The women wept and prayed. And then at 5:30 p.m. that day, the men were taken a little distance away. The 31 men called forward one by one, stabbed and finished off with machetes. And as if that wasn't enough, the severed leg of a white man was brought into the women, and they were made to pass it round, even the children. Their mother let the girls think it was from an animal the Simbas had killed. Monday, the 31st of May, the women and children were made to trek into the forest, the Simbas trying to keep them away from the National Army, who they knew were looking for them. And they set off with the words of Job 23:10, which came into Margaret's mind, and she shared, "But he knoweth the way I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold." This assured Margaret even this was part of God's plan for her life. Margaret and the others whose glasses had been taken were paired with those who could see, so they didn't trip over things, and eventually they arrived at a village, constantly being made to move on. Their feet were painful, they were sore, they had hardly any food, they were exhausted, some had malaria. As planes flew over looking for them, they were again and again threatened with execution. Convinced death was imminent, the sisters confessed to one another and forgave freely. Margaret thanked them for their love and care and again prepared herself to die. She knew she was ready, she knew she was at peace, but again the threatened execution didn't come. Margaret prayed often for rescue, again and again setting those dates. Then she realised she'd been asking God to answer in her time and her way. Whenever she came back again to that place of submission and trust, she felt her burden lifted and her peace restored in spite of the unchanging circumstances. She'd seek to reflect on something of the Lord's earthly life, looking for parallels between what he'd faced and what she faced. Concentration for prayer became increasingly difficult with the starvation, but often walking would help them to pray, though they were constantly facing the taunts of their captors. Thursday, the 24th of June, Margaret suddenly felt a great desire to pray for their liberation, and she prostrated herself, hidden from view by the sisters, because prayer would anger the Simbas. And she felt overwhelmed by the presence of God. And these words were impressed on her from Mark 5:36. "Be not afraid, only believe." As she shared this with the sisters, they saw the deep peace on her face. Friday, June the 25th. The Simbas seemed restless. They were talking about moving them on again. Food was even lower. Margaret remembers pleading with the Lord, "We can't go on much longer, Lord." And again, Mark 5:36, "Be not afraid, only believe." It was a wet night. The roof had many holes. They were all drenched and couldn't sleep. Saturday, June the 26th, and Bev might think I'm really losing it now because I've written on her list Corpus Christi. Don't know how many of you celebrate Corpus Christi. So saints and feast days were important to the sisters, but obviously they weren't to Margaret. But Corpus Christi is the day that Catholics worship Jesus for who he is and for what he has done. So on that occasion, Margaret felt she could gladly join them in prayer and praise of the Lord. At 2:31 p.m, there was shooting, shouting, and a great commotion. They hid under or behind anything that they thought might give them protection. Then all went quiet, the Simbas had fled, and in French these words were spoken: "Good day, sisters. Good day, ladies. Come, you are liberated." It was a Catholic chaplain who brought that greeting. There was also a doctor among the mercenaries who was very useful as they were liberated. They were then led out of the jungle, their energy amazingly renewed. They were taken back to the convent, and everyone's cases were found to be still there, except Margaret's. But she was delighted to find just one dress, and her good sandals, and to her great joy, her spare spectacles. They took it in turns to bathe and change, and then went to the chapel to give thanks. They slept that night in real beds with full stomachs, knowing they'd soon be evacuated. Sunday, June the 27th, Margaret was given a small knapsack which was plenty big enough for the few possessions she now had. But she had neither money or passport. Was this going to cause her problems? It didn't. She was told to her great delight that her parents were still alive. They were very elderly. And in fact, they'd recently got a TV, and she later heard that they saw her boarding the plane in Leopoldville. Her brother collected her from Heathrow. Oh, quite happy things as well, didn't you? And she was given a hero's welcome by her parents' neighbours. A few days later, Margaret bought herself a Bible and daily light again. She read the portion for June 26th, the evening of her liberation. Those words of scripture that were so appropriate, though she couldn't read them at the time, were Exodus 12:42. It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. Margaret and those who suffered alongside her had indeed also experienced liberation by the Lord from the suffering they had endured. Though she had gone through such hardship, had witnessed such evil, and felt grief for many precious friends who hadn't made it out, Margaret's testimony was Psalm 126 verse 3, the Lord has done great things for us and we are filled with joy. Even having gone through all that she did, having had some time to recover, she was soon back serving in Africa as she loved to do. And in 1987, she received the honour from the Queen, member of the Order of the British Empire for nursing and welfare service in Niger, which is where she later served. Yet Margaret would always say, when praised for her great faith during her trials, it wasn't that her faith was great, but that her God is great. He had brought his light by his felt presence into those dreadful 8 months. Margaret is still alive. She's 96 and living in a pilgrim home in Essex. And Helen was with me when I received a phone call. I've been trying to track her down, and I received a phone call from a friend of hers on Tuesday evening when we were here. He said she's well. She's taken to church every Sunday. She's only quite recently been moved into the pilgrim home from living independently. She was a member of Hook Evangelical Church. He said he thinks she'd quite like to run the home. A strong woman, as I agreed missionaries are. And she devotes much of her time to her schedule of prayer. The world is not worthy of them. Oh, sorry, dear. Right, it's time to end, so we will end by singing.